Okay, guys, in this screencast, we're going to talk a little bit about classification. There's 8.7 million organisms that need to be organized. So there's a whole lot of living things out there on Earth. And actually, I included down here at the bottom this little article, How Many Species? The study says 8.7 million, but it's tricky. If you're interested, you can go to the slideshow in Moodle and check that article out and learn a little bit more about just how many living things we have floating around the Earth. But that said, let's go on. So why do we need to classify organisms? And I put a picture in here of something that I think many of you will never get the opportunity to experience. This is a record store. So before CDs became, or before iTunes became popular, we had CDs, and before CDs we had tapes, and before tapes we had records, and we had 8-tracks, and there used to be stores, and I guess there still is a store in the mall that's, a music store, but it's not quite the same as it was when I was a kid. But anyway, what I wanted to point out here is if you wanted to go to the store and buy your favorite CD or album, you would have to know where to look. So in this picture, we see some things that help us, right? We see, well, here's folk. And then we notice, too, that the things are in kind of alphabetical order as well. But as you walk into a store, you typically would have different sections. So if you think about the sections, you might have a section for rock. You might have a section for pop or country or blues or jazz. I guess blues would have an S on it. So you walk into a record store and you look around and here's our sections, and then you go to the section you want, and then they're put in alphabetical order by bands, and then once you find the band, they're put in order by their different albums the band has done. Just like if you go to the grocery store, everything is classified, right? I have my dairy back in the corner maybe, and I have my deli section where I get my meats. I have the butcher section where I get, like steaks and chicken. I have the produce section where I can get my greens. So we organize everything, and we need to do that for organisms too. And the big reason we need to do that is just so we can find them. So organisms basically need names. So if I want to talk to you about an organism, and you're across the ocean in another country, we need to be able to name that. And a guy came up with a long time ago a way of naming them, and it's called binomial nomenclature. Now, I found this little image online. I thought it might help you out a little bit, because what it really means, and you know how I like to break down words, bi means two, nomial means name, and then you have this nomen again. So we see N-O-M, N-O-M. So that nomial or nome is really what means name. And then clature is system. So we have a two-name name system. So a two-name naming system. And what we do is we end up using the genus and species. It says it over here. So we use the genus and species to name things. So in our case, in humans, we have Homo sapiens. So Homo would be, let's see if I can do this. It's kind of hard on this thing. Homo would be the genus, and sapiens would be the species. Notice something here. The genus is always a capital letter, and the species is always a lowercase letter. And we'll talk about that later. So I have two more questions for you. Why not just use common names, like humans? Well, first of all, what we maybe call a garter snake here in the United States, or even in Pennsylvania and other parts of the world, they might have a different term for that garter snake. So if we name it with a scientific name, if we use its genus and species, it becomes more clear as we're talking to people from other areas. Also, why do we use Latin? Okay, so Latin is the scientific language, and it's kind of universal, right? Nobody really speaks it anymore, but as far as naming organisms and using it in science, it's a pretty universal language. So it doesn't matter if you're in Paris or you're in Germany or if you're in Russia. When we talk about a garter snake, we're both going to be using Latin, and we're both going to understand what each other is talking about. Okay, moving on. So there's two important guys in this discussion. The first guy is Aristotle, and you'll see here he lived from 384 BC to 322 BC. So he's kind of an old guy, I mean, it's been a long time ago. It explains why we don't have a good picture of him, right? We have these statues of him. And then Carl Linnaeus lived from 1707 to 1778. And he's the other important guy. And these are the two guys that really spent some time talking about how to put this classification thing together, how to name organisms. So if we look at good old Aristotle, he was really the first. He came up with the first system for classifying organisms, and he had two main groups. He said all organisms are going to fall into either plants or animals. Plants he classified by structure, animals by habitat. Now, he did some good stuff, and this is good. You know, I mean, he did some great stuff really just by coming up with the whole idea of naming organisms. But naming them by structure is pretty good. Naming plants by structure, we still do that today. But he made a mistake, I guess, when he decided to name animals by habitat. So think about that for a second. Why would that be so bad? Let me give you an example. This is a redfoot tortoise, right? This is Herbie. We have Herbie over in Mr. Beichler's room. It's actually not a picture of Herbie, but Herbie is a redfoot tortoise, just like these two tortoises pictured. Notice something about them. You know, they have these big shells. They're living on land. All right, so if I threw this turtle into a pond, it would sink like a rock. And over here, we have a red ear slider. Very different. A couple things to point out. This is an aquatic turtle. See his little webbed foot back there? Thinner shell. It's probably not as heavy. Here's the deal. By Aristotle's system, we would name these guys or classify these guys by habitat. So what would their habitat be? Are they aquatic or are they terrestrial? And that's really where we came up with the problem. Think about some birds. You know, a duck that spends most of its time in the water, would we classify it based on the fact that it lives in water? But other birds spend most of their time flying. What about an ostrich? Spends most of the time on the ground. So it became pretty apparent that this was a problem because we had these kind of gray areas where some animals, you know, members of the same type of animal lived in different habitats. Let's just leave it at that for now. So along comes Linnaeus, a long time later, and he invents this binomial nomenclature, the two-name naming system that grouped everything by structure. So in fact, today, classification is based on some other things. It's based on homologous structures, comparative biochemistry, comparative embryology, and genetics, where we look at chromosomes and DNA. Now, these three right here, we're going to talk a lot more when we talk about evolution, because they're also some of the main evidences for evolution. But a quick rundown would say, homologous structures is when we look at like maybe the bones of your arm and comparing the bones of a bird's wing or the bones of a whale's fin, and we find out that those bones are actually very similar. In biochemistry and embryology, we'll talk a lot more too when we talk about evolution. In fact, I believe that DNA down here fits into biochemistry as well. And when we get to genetics, when we talk about genetics, we'll talk a lot more about how we use these things to classify things. Really, we're looking forward or looking for how closely related two organisms are. So if we look at the organism's DNA, we can see how closely related they are. If we look at their structures, we can see how closely related they are. Like I said, we'll talk a lot more about that later. So a real quick little mini lesson here in the middle, because it will help us understand when we move on. And plus, we haven't talked too much about cells. So there's a difference between a prokaryotic cell and a eukaryotic cell. A eukaryotic cell, basically the thing you need to know is that these are cells that have a nucleus. Prokaryotic cells have no nucleus. Now, it actually goes beyond this, and when we get into talking about cells, it'll make a little more sense, because we could define this as no membrane-bound organelles. So if we look over here at the eukaryotic cell, this right here is depicting the nucleus. Now, the nucleus is three-dimensional, so what they've done is they've cut a slice out of it and opened it up. If we come over to the prokaryotic cells, you don't see any nucleus. So in the nucleus of a eukaryotic cell is where we would find our little strands of DNA. Over here, the DNA is just all kind of loose, right? There's no nucleus. So this is a big difference. And why does that matter? Well, if you're a prokaryotic cell, you're a bacteria. So if we look here at this tree, we're going to start over here on this side. We're thinking that down here is the first cells that ever existed. And as evolution went on, or as time went on, they started to branch off. So at some point, the two cells became very different and they broke away from each other. This trend leads us to the bacteria cells that we really think about when we talk about bacteria today. This trend comes up and branches off again. So the archaea are really what we think of as the ancient bacteria. These are the guys that could live in some really extreme environments. I almost like to call them extremophiles, but they could live in like salt-loving environments or in really, really hot springs and things like that. As we go up here, we get to the eukaryota. And so these are the cells with nucleuses. And then they leave rise to a lot of the things that we think about: plants, fungi, animals, molds, protists, ciliates. You know, these both are protists, so flagellates and ciliates is the way to move. We'll talk about it then. It's pretty cool. So anyway, this is really what's happening here. So let's look over here at how we started to classify, or how we classify things. Here's life. So this is all life on Earth. And these three dots are kind of indicating that all life on Earth can be divided into three groups or domains. Now, domains are something we've never taught in the past, but we're going to learn about them a little bit here. And our three domains are bacteria, archaea, and eukaryota. So then we take these and we break those down into kingdoms. And then we take kingdoms and break them into phylums, and break them into classes, and break them into orders, and break them into families, and break them into genuses. You've seen this word before, right? Because we use it in that binomial nomenclature word. And then finally we break them into species. And this is an individual, right? Individual species, right? So this is like Homo sapiens, right? Genus Homo, and then species sapiens. So we actually name our organisms, that binomial nomenclature right here with those two guys. Let's see if we can make it make a little more sense, because sometimes I think when I do these I just don't. So here we go. Here's life. Here's what we talked about. We break it into three domains. So we have domain 1, 2, and 3. And then we break each domains into kingdoms. Now there's only one kingdom in bacteria. There's only one kingdom in archaea. But under eukaryote, or here they're calling it eukarya, there's four kingdoms. So this is where we have the protista, the plant, fungus, and animal kingdoms. So in the past, what we've done is used Linnaeus' system over here, which is this kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So really what you ought to do right now is pause this thing and repeat this to yourself 476 times until you can say kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, so you know it. When we come back to it, so we have kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And let's just take a closer look at that before we end this to see what it would look like if we tried to figure out the species of one organism and how that would change. So, and I think the one that we're going to use is going to take us all the way out to domain. It does. So right here, we're starting at domain. So we're starting at the domain eukarya. And now remember, this is every organism that has cells with nucleuses in them. So it's every organism other than the bacteria. And they're showing you that here. They're showing you some protists, some plants, some fungi, and then a whole bunch of animals. And it's a little skewed because there's a lot of plants and fungus on the earth and protists on the earth. But we're looking for an animal. We're trying to figure out the black bear here. So then the next thing we go to, kingdom, phylum, or domain, kingdom. So we're going to be in kingdom Animalia. So this kingdom includes all the animals, down to the sponges, starfish, invertebrates, fish, reptiles, birds, amphibians, mammals. Then we go to phylum Chordata. So in kingdom Chordata, we have all the chordates, so mostly vertebrates. So if you'll notice here, we got rid of all the invertebrates, so we don't have the starfish anymore. We don't have sponges anymore. We don't have any insects anymore. Then we go to kingdom Mammalia, and we get rid of the birds and reptiles and fish and amphibians. So we've gone kingdom, phylum, class. I think I said kingdom Mammalia. It's supposed to be class Mammalia. Then out of all the mammals, we look at just the order for Carnivora. So we're going to get rid of these guys like the zebras that don't eat meat, and we have just the carnivores. Then we go to the family, Ursidae. And so now we're down to just these guys. Now we go to Ursus. Now we're down to just these bears here. And then finally the species is Americanus. So we name this bear with its genus and its species. So its genus is Ursus Americanus. Notice the uppercase and the lowercase letter, right? So this is how we organize things. We can take any organism in the world and do this. So you are going to have a really good understanding by the end of this if I put something in front of you to figure out what it is. What kingdom does it go into? What are some of its major characteristics to break it down probably into a phylum? We won't have to go the whole way from domain to species for everything we look at, but it's a nice way to understand how this stuff works. All right? Great. Thank you.